Welcome to English 2450, COM 2010, Intro to Film, Week 11, lecture video number 2 on sound design. In this video I'll be talking about the key players of sound design and different types of sound used in film. So in my last video I talked a little bit about the role of the sound designer. Now this term was coined by Walter Murch, who works in editing and sound design. And the sound designer is specifically the person that's kind of in charge of the sound crew. They supervise all of the aspects of sound in a film. And this is from pre-production to post-production. They start the design process, what will the film sound like, before the film is actually being shot. And they see that through to the very end during post when everything is being edited together. So the sound designer is the person who's in charge of kind of supervising and developing that sound. And this term came into use in like the 1970s or so. Now the sound crew on any given film is going to be pretty massive, though, not just a sound designer. The work can't be done by a single person. You also have editors, boom operators, gaffers, composers, Foley artists, re-recording mixers, and many more people who play important roles in not just creating the sound of the film, but in choosing sound from different takes, layering the sounds together and manipulating those sounds to make them all work so that the final product sounds the way that the designer and the director envisioned it to. So, editors is basically exactly what it sounds like. We've already talked a little bit about film editing, and there are specifically editors that work on sound as well. Boom operators, those are the people that kind of run around with those big boom mics and capture noise on location and on set. Gaffers, we've talked a little bit about back when we talked on visual design and especially lighting. Gaffers are electricians, and obviously when you're creating the sound for a film and capturing sound, you need electricians to make sure that all of your kind of recording equipment is set up properly and works. Composers, we already know what a film composer does. Foley artists I'll talk about a little bit more in a later video, but the basic idea is that a Foley artist is someone who recreates sounds specifically for the film, timed to synchronize with the film itself, and re-recording mixers are the people that kind of take and mix the ADR, automatic dialogue replacement, or any kind of post-production re-recording, whether it's dialogue or something else. So all of these different people, and there are more, work on the sound crew to ensure that the sounds are captured or created, that they're chosen carefully, they're layered and mixed carefully, and they're manipulated in order to achieve the kind of the most effective use of sound in a film. So that's the sound crew, kind of in a nutshell. That's what the sound crew does. But we also have to think about different types of sound in a film, right? It's easier to kind of break it down when we think about sound being kind of categorized in film, right? So in most films, at any given point in time, if you closed your eyes and you just listened, you would hear something. You would hear something going on. And it's also important to consider silence as a type of sound in a film too, right? Silence is just as important as these other types of sounds that we're going to be talking about here. So I've got this broken down here to kind of clarify what different types of sounds are used in film and to what different effects. So one of the most obvious types of sound is dialogue, spoken words. Dialogue can be internal or external. Now, internal is like when you're hearing someone's kind of inner thoughts. Their mouth isn't necessarily moving. They might not even necessarily be on screen, but they're kind of speaking sort of internally. It's like the voice inside your head or the voice of God. External is where, the person is actually speaking to someone else. Externally, their mouth is moving. So we know dialogue is one type of sound in film. Narration is a little bit more specific than dialogue, right? Narration is also spoken words, but narration is specifically kind of moving the story forward, right? It's telling us kind of important pieces of the plot or giving us some kind of parceling out information about the story. So dialogue and narration are not the exact same. Dialogue is typically when a character is speaking to another character. A character might be like speaking to themselves in a mirror, for example. But narration is specifically talking to the audience, giving the audience information about the story to move it forward. Sometimes the narrator is a character within the story, but often you'll get a third person omniscient. narrator. That's like the voice of God, right? That's someone who's telling us and parceling out information about the story as a narrator, but we don't assume that they're within the story. They're outside of the story, kind of explaining it to us. So one good example of this would be in the Cutting Edge documentary that we watched in class. That third-person omniscient narrator is the actress Kathy Bates. She's the one who's narrating the documentary to us and giving us information so that we can continue kind of moving forward through it with the information that we need. So we've got dialogue and we've got narration. Now these have two slightly different functions, but they are related to each other. Sound effects are sounds that are officially created for the soundtrack or that are recorded, quote, in the wild, right? And they have a definite function in telling the story. That's the important thing about a sound effect. It has a definite function in telling the story. It kind of helps flesh out the narrative world, right? So sound effects can be recorded in the wild, which means like as the shooting is going on, someone walks through a door, the creak of the door was actually recorded when the actor opened the door and it creaked, right? That was recorded in the wild. Foley artists recreate sounds artificially after the fact. So they watch a projected version of the film with no sound, and then they would recreate that door creaking, rather than that door creaking being recorded in the moment when the door was actually opened. So sound effects can be created artificially, or they can be recorded sort of naturally. They have a function in telling the story. Now, this is different than ambient noise or background noise. Background noise is just kind of that white noise that might be like traffic off in the distance or footsteps going down a hallway, that ambient kind of like whooshing noise that sometimes you get in films. White noise, right? It doesn't necessarily serve a purpose or have a definite function, but it exists to kind of flesh out the world. Because if you stop and you're quiet and you listen to the world around you, there is always background noise. We are very, very rarely in total silence. We are very, very rarely in total silence. And films recreate that, right, through the use of ambient or background noise. If it was just nothingness, total silence, it'd be really uncomfortable. So most films use some type of ambient or background noise to add a level of kind of warmth and depth and reality to the world of the film. Now, we also know that obviously films use music. That can be the score of the film, or that can be specific songs on the soundtrack. Sometimes the music is created specifically for the film, and sometimes it's not. A lot of films reuse older songs or older scores, right? And sometimes they are created specifically for that film, So these are different types of sound that are used in the filmmaking process. Dialogue, narration, sound effects, ambient and background noise, and music. Now, the next thing to think about here are the stages of sound production. Like I said, sound design in the 1970s was kind of this movement that really pushed for sound to be an important part of all of the stages of film production. So rather than kind of after the fact, we have this film, we'll go back in and kind of clean up the sound, touch it up a little bit, maybe re-record some dialogue. In modern contemporary sound design, sound production is a much kind of lengthier and more involved process. And it can be broken down really into 4 different stages here. Design, recording, editing, and mixing. Design, recording, editing, and mixing. And in this video, I'll talk about the first 2, and the next video I'll start to break down the differences between editing and mixing, because that's a little bit complicated. So important note here, sound designers work alongside directors throughout the entire filmmaking process, but most of the sounds are created in post-production. So even though the sound designer is an important part of the filmmaking process from pre-production on, the actual creation and editing of sounds is typically after the film has already been made. Now that might sound a little bit surprising, but it's just important to remember that a lot of the sound captured during the actual filming process can't be used for one reason or another. So a lot of it is kind of done after the fact. So we've already talked about the designing of sound, right? The designing of sound. So let's move on to the recording of sound. So we know that designing is kind of the sort of theoretical or more abstract process of what is this film going to sound like. And then recording is where you get into kind of the nitty-gritty, the detail work, right? So most film sound is recorded and stored digitally now. Most of it is digital. It's easier to access and it's easier to manipulate if it is done digitally rather than analog on, like, you know, a tape of some sort, right? So recording film sound on a separate medium than the image is recorded on is called a double system recording. So if you're recording these two things separately, the film is on one strip of tape, the sound is on another strip of tape. That's double system recording, right? And there are good reasons to do it that way, but it can also be a little bit more complicated too. In some films, the sound is recorded first, but most of the time, like I said, sound is done in post-production. Sounds are done after the fact. In animation, sound is recorded first because then the animators can use that sound to animate the film. The sound becomes the basis of how the film is animated. But most of the time, sound is done during post-production. And like I said before, Foley effects are created and recorded in sync with the picture, right? Foley effects are created and recorded in sync with the picture. So if you go to the clips and images for this week in Canvas and you scroll down, there's a really interesting video here on the work of Foley artists. It shows Foley artists kind of doing what they do to recreate sounds as they kind of watch a projected version of a film without any sound. They kind of recreate those sounds. We talked about this a little bit in class. It's like the idea of snapping a bunch of celery to get the sound of a broken bone, right? That's a Foley effect. That's created by a Foley artist in a studio after the film has already been shot and recorded in sync with the picture. So these are the first two steps or stages of sound production. You've got the design step and you have the recording step. And in my next video, I'll move on to the next two stages, which are editing and mixing. So stay tuned for that.